In this book by Gavin Ortlund called What It Means to Be Protestant, he argues that Protestants are a reform movement from within the Catholic Church, not something that demolishes it. And he particularly points to the importance of the authority of Scripture and the removal of religious accretions of tradition as part of what it means to be Protestant. Likely every or most evangelicals would benefit from reading this book. I think that if you're familiar with the Reformation time period in theology, perhaps a confessional person, or someone professionally interested in these topics, you may find the book a little bit too simplistic. At the same time, I doubt that's most listeners. I think that's kind of a select group of people. Most evangelicals likely need to read this book just for the basic notions that Protestants, for example, claim to be Catholic, claim to be part of that holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that has been renewed and reformed in these later times. When it comes to strengths, there's a lot of notable items in this book. I think particularly I appreciate his close reading of primary sources throughout. I think it's very easy to argue about what it means to be Protestant, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, etc., by means of just simply listening to apologists or secondary literature or popular level books. But I really appreciated that Gavin himself goes pretty deep into the primary sources to tell you what is going on. He reads authors like John Jewell, Richard Hooker, Martin Luther, John Calvin, even early Christian figures as well, in order to show that what's going on in the Reformation is that the Reformers are seeing themselves in continuity with the most ancient form of the church, and are basically accusing Rome of innovations. And in particular, those innovations, as he'll talk about later, are things like their particular views of Mary, as well as their particular views of icons. But in particular, I think it's helpful just to see that this is a book that is reading primary sources, documents, creeds, canons, etc. It's incredibly helpful for that reason. It gives you access to the sources. I also thought the structure was interesting. When he talks about the Reformation in particular, he points to things like the mistreatment of religious dissidents by Rome because of their view of authority, namely that earthly powers kind of submitted to the heavenly powers, you might say. Can't remember the exact terminology used, but the idea is that Rome claimed to be able to use earthly and temporal powers for their particular ends, which led to various kinds of persecutions, like against Jan Hus, that were particularly cruel and unjust, and people did not love that. As well, indulgences and the financial exploitations of Rome, exploiting people's faith for money, got people pretty upset. And so in this context, he shows us sola fide and some of the key arguments based on the Reformation were really fitting for their time period as well. In this regard, it's also very commendable, I noticed, that he doesn't make some of the mistakes that I often hear Christian apologists make, or even Christian theologians or whatever, who basically say things like, well, Rome believes that you're saved by works, Protestants believe you're saved by faith. It's really, not true on both sides. Protestants claim that works are necessary for salvation. This is just normal, regular things that are said. There's a particular way in which that fits in. You're justified by grace through faith, and then you have sort of an irreversible relationship to works because you're saved for good works, as Paul says in Ephesians 2. And the Roman Church has their way of putting it that I would personally disagree with, of course, but it is based on grace and mercy and so on. So the sort of like commonplace accusations are out of place. And further, they're not exactly true to the sources, at least in the 16th century either, in terms of what are the real debates. So he does a good job of avoiding those misconceptions, while at the same time pointing out the real differences, whether those are differences about the Eucharist, how grace comes to us, what we mean by justification, the various kinds of it. It's really, really, really important. And he does a good job, I think, of exposing that the differences are a bit deeper and less simplistic. So it's more accurate, more truthful, which is better. I think the deeper you are into history, the clearer you can be on these differences, and ultimately the more Protestant you should become, because as Gavin brings out, to be Protestant means you can truly be Catholic, because you can believe Christians are where there is genuine belief. For the most part, Roman teaching and Orthodox teaching, generally speaking, will say things like there's salvation, you must be a part of their visible institution of the church to be saved, to be part of the Orthodoxy or part of Rome, in association with the Pope or so on, to be saved. There's some softening here and there, but this is a pretty regular position that these churches have. Whereas if you're a Protestant, you can simply say, well, where word and sacraments are, where faith is, where the Spirit is, there the church is also. And so there's a real opportunity to be more Catholic, I suppose, than the Roman Catholics in this specific category. And Gavin brings that out as well, which I enjoyed. In terms of shortcomings, I'm not sure there's anything major in here, except for, as I said, it's a bit simplistic. Like, I think if you're someone who's, into Reformation history, or you're someone who is, part of a confessional tradition that kind of knows a lot of these things already, you might say, okay, I'm not sure you're the target audience for this book. It's in the Zondervan Reflective series. It seems to be for people who are evangelical, Protestant, maybe not, maybe outside the traditions too, who need an introduction to the big picture stuff. And to be fair, although I've studied a lot of this, there are some things to me that I was like, oh, that's a great way of saying it. I mean, things like when he was talking about the authority of Scripture, I found incredibly helpful. He said things like obvious things, but when you kind of hear them said in a fresh way, it clicks. So Protestants believe in the Scripture is the only infallible guide of truth, but we don't believe that there are other guides of truth or other authorities. I mean, children obey their parents, workers obey their employers, etc. What we're saying when it comes to the Bible, it's the only infallible rule of truth. And we don't think that there are other infallible rules of truth, nor do we think there's any elevated rules of truth that are more or less infallible, like ex cathedra statements and so on. We all agree, whatever tradition you're in, that Scripture is unique, it's special, it comes from God, it has authority. But Protestants are pretty adamant that Scripture is our only infallible rule of truth, which is hugely helpful and clarifying, because it doesn't mean we deny tradition, it doesn't mean that we deny councils, the authority of any of those things, the authority of experts, the authority of ecclesial leaders, the authority of pastors, etc. We affirm all those things. We just say that their authority is fallible. They'll make mistakes. And at the end of the day, we have that particular freedom to say, when those mistakes are made clear, that we'd rather obey God than men, as the apostles did as well. In order to make his argument about there being reform from the inside of the church, he uses Philip Schaff's work, and in particular, I think the article or the writing was called The Principle of the Protestant Reformation, something like that. And Schaff's great. He's connected with Nevin. This is the Mercersburg theology, Mercersburg thinking in the U.S. It's interesting, helpful stuff, but it also is a little bit peculiar. Nevin in particular is a bit strange in his arguments. I think Schaff is a bit more mainstream, but I wish he would have shown the more broader way that people have made this argument. I mean, I know he brought up John Calvin, who talks about there being true churches in Rome, and Martin Luther and so on. That's all good, but I just felt like he needed to expand his source set. The Mercersburg theology is, fine, but by definition a little bit peculiar, not really mainstream in the Reformed world, and it could sort of hurt his argument that he wasn't as central. He didn't bring out any other kind of key players. I think Schaff's fine to bring out, don't mishear me, but you need a few other people that would be within that orbit as well. He also seems to kind of miss the mark on righteousness a bit. He does talk about how the Reformed talk about imputed righteousness, and the Catholics, talk about infused righteousness, but really, when you read the Reformed and also the Reformed scholastics, it's fine to use infused righteousness or habitual righteousness if you're Reformed, or to talk about righteousness in two kinds or sometimes three kinds that overlap today with what we mean by justification and sanctification. It's fine to do that. You just got to explain what you mean by your words. At the end of the day, if you're going to use infused righteousness, you're going to mean something like imputed righteousness. So, okay. If you're going to say habitual righteousness, you're going to mean something like sanctification. Totally fine. I get that. But I kind of wish he was a little bit more open with the linguistic differences. It's more about the key judgments that are being made. Protestants typically believe that whatever the infusion or imputation is, it means at that moment, prior to anything done in you, through the mercy of God, from the grace of God, through the mercy of God, you are justified, fully, and therefore you are not in danger of falling from grace due to, let's say, a mortal sin, nor do you need to purgate yourself for temporal punishments, which end up amounting to purgatory in the Roman way of thinking. So anyways, I think he could have maybe done a bit of a better job clarifying those things. I mean, I know that it was more of a simple, straightforward book, and it's also in the Zondervan reflective, not Zondervan academic, line. So I get it. These are a little bit nitpicky. So at the end of the day, I still think it's great. I still think evangelicals should read it. Again, if you're kind of an expert in this field, you might find it a little bit simplistic. However, he says things in wonderful ways. His order of arguments interesting. It could just be worth it just to kind of clarify ideas that you already believe, but maybe to learn different ways of putting it. If you're more of a confessional tradition, you might find some of the things that he says a little bit off. As I know with righteousness, that's fine too. I don't really think you need to agree with every book you read. That's sort of an absurd standard. And I also would just say, if you read this and you liked it, or if you feel like maybe it's too straightforward for you, just read the works of Oberman, Gordon, Steinmetz, and others in this area who give you the more full, detailed picture of all the history and the theological nuances that you might want if you find this book too introductory. So despite my kind of minor criticisms, I'd recommend this book for evangelicals in general. Yes, those who are confessional too, and yes, experts too. If you just kind of want it to see what people in the same space that you're in, or how they're talking, what they're talking about. It's refreshing, honestly. This book, I kind of grew up at the end of a generation which simply did not understand its own past and viewed everyone who wasn't just like us as somehow the bad guys because they had some nuanced difference on issues. So it is nice to read a book like this where you actually get to the key issues, you think more big picture, and you are, I mean, I wouldn't say you're deep in history because it's a small book, but you're at least getting deeper into history than some Protestants have been willing to do in the last decade. So for this reason, yep, read the book, enjoy the book, and if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, hit a bell if you would like to as well. Thanks for watching.